The emergency room was chaos, as usual. Beeping monitors, the sharp scent of antiseptic, the hushed urgency of doctors and nurses moving between patients. It was just another night at the hospital. Nurse Helen had worked the night shift for years, and she'd seen it all. People came in with all sorts of injuries and ailments, some minor, some severe. But there was one unspoken truth in the ER: not everyone could be saved. And not everyone was a priority. She had learned to make quick decisions, to assess which patients needed immediate care and which could wait. It was part of the job. Triage meant that some cases, especially those who were likely beyond help, had to be pushed aside for those with a real chance. And so, when they wheeled in the frail old man on the gurney, barely breathing, his skin ashen and his eyes fluttering weakly, Helen barely spared him a glance. Another lost cause. The paramedics rattled off his vitals as they passed her station, but she only half listened. Unresponsive, weak pulse, severe dehydration. He was in bad shape. They mentioned something about finding him collapsed outside a convenience store, no identification, no family, just a nameless, dying man who would likely pass before morning. Helen sighed. She had too many critical patients to deal with already. The doctors could handle this one if they had the time, but she wasn't going to waste resources on someone who had already lost the fight. She moved on, tending to other patients: someone with a deep laceration, a child with a high fever, a young woman clutching her stomach in pain. But as the night dragged on, something about the old man nagged at her. Maybe it was the way he lay so still, his chest barely rising. Or maybe it was the silence around him: no wailing family, no concerned friends. Just a body waiting for the inevitable. Eventually, as her shift neared its end, she found herself standing by his bedside. His breathing was shallow, his skin cold. There was little doubt he wouldn't make it. Just another nameless patient lost to the night. But then, something caught her eye. A nurse's aide had been going through his pockets, looking for any identification. And just as Helen was about to turn away, the aide pulled out a thin, worn wallet and flipped it open. Helen glanced over, not expecting much: maybe a faded ID, some loose cash, nothing significant. But the moment she saw the name on the card inside, her breath caught in her throat. Her entire body froze. It couldn't be. It couldn't be him. Yet there it was, printed clearly on the ID, a name she hadn't seen in years. A name that sent a cold wave crashing over her, making her pulse pound in her ears. The nameless man dying in front of her wasn't a stranger after all. He was someone she had once known, someone she had never expected to see again. And suddenly, everything changed. Helen's hands trembled as she reached for the wallet. The room around her faded into a dull hum: the beeping machines, the muffled voices of other nurses, the overhead announcements. All of it became distant as her eyes locked onto the name on the ID. A name she never thought she'd see again. A name she had buried in the recesses of her memory, convincing herself that it was part of a past she had left behind. But there it was, as real as the frail man lying motionless in front of her. Her breath hitched. Could it be a coincidence? The name wasn't exactly common, but it wasn't impossible for another person to have it. Still, as her eyes drifted from the ID back to the man's face, doubt melted away, replaced by a chilling certainty. Even under the weight of time, beneath the wrinkles and the wear of hard years, she recognized him. The shape of his nose, the curve of his jaw, the slight scar near his temple: it was him. 1,000 thoughts crashed through her mind, but none settled long enough for her to grasp them. Memories clawed their way to the surface, fragments of a life she had spent years trying to forget. A younger version of herself, a different place, different circumstances. She had been naive then, trusting, unaware of how quickly life could turn from something hopeful to something dark. And this man had been at the center of it all. Helen's grip tightened around the ID, her nails pressing into the worn leather of the wallet. She had to remind herself to breathe, to act normal. No one else knew what was going through her mind, no one could possibly understand the storm raging inside her. She was a professional. She had seen people from all walks of life come and go through the ER doors: criminals, victims, strangers whose stories she would never fully know. And yet, out of all the people who could have ended up here tonight, why him? Why now? She turned slightly, scanning the room, half expecting someone else to come rushing in, someone connected to him, someone who could take the weight of this moment off her shoulders. But there was no one. Just him. Alone. Dying. And now, she was the only one who knew who he really was. She could feel the weight of a decision pressing down on her. Did she tell the doctors? Did she walk away and pretend she had never seen that ID? Did she do something she had been too afraid to do all those years ago? Face the past, demand answers, hold him accountable? Her pulse pounded as she reached for his medical chart. No name had been written down yet, just the generic John Doe. The paramedics hadn't known who he was, and without an ID when he arrived, he had been just another anonymous patient lost in the shuffle of a busy night. No one had connected him to a name. No one except her. Helen swallowed hard. She had a choice. She could leave the past buried, let him slip away unnoticed, just another unfortunate soul who didn't make it. Or she could finally confront the truth she had spent years running from. Her fingers hovered over the clipboard. And then, as if sensing the weight of her hesitation, the man on the bed let out a faint, rattling breath. Helen froze. His eyes fluttered open. For the first time that night, he looked at her. And in that moment, she saw it: recognition. He knew exactly who she was. Helen's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as she locked eyes with the man on the bed. His gaze, hazy and weak, still held something sharp beneath the exhaustion, something that sent an icy shiver down her spine. Recognition. He knew her. Even in his fragile state, barely holding on, something flickered in those dark eyes, something that felt like a question, or maybe a warning. Her grip tightened on the chart. A part of her had prayed she was wrong, that maybe this was just a resemblance, a trick of her tired mind. But no. It was him. The man she had spent years trying to forget. The man responsible for things she never spoke about. The man who had disappeared from her life without a trace until now. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. His breath rattled in his chest, a weak attempt at speaking, but it was as if even the effort of acknowledging her was too much. Helen swallowed hard. A part of her wanted to turn away, to let him slip back into unconsciousness, to pretend she had never seen that flicker of recognition. But another part, an angrier, older part of her, wanted him to talk. Wanted answers. Before she could say anything, another nurse stepped up beside her. Is he responding? The woman asked, peering at the monitors. Helen hesitated for half a second before slipping the wallet into her pocket. Barely, she murmured, forcing herself to sound neutral. Vitals are weak. The other nurse nodded, scribbling notes on the chart. Honestly, I don't think he's got much time left. If we don't get him stable soon. She trailed off, shaking her head. Helen gave a slow nod, but inside, her mind was racing. If he died tonight, she would never get the truth. The thought unsettled her more than she expected. She had spent years convincing herself she didn't care. That she had moved on. That the past was the past, and dredging it up wouldn't change anything. But standing here, staring at the man who had once held so much power over her life, she realized she wasn't as detached as she had pretended to be. A commotion near the entrance of the ER snapped her out of her thoughts. The doors burst open, and a man in a dark coat strode in, his eyes scanning the room with the kind of urgency that sent alarms ringing in Helen's mind. He wasn't a frantic family member or a concerned friend, his movements were too calculated for that. Helen's stomach clenched as he approached the nurse's station. I'm looking for a patient, he said, his voice smooth but firm. Brought in earlier tonight. Elderly male. Found near the East Side Market. Helen's fingers curled into her palm. He was looking for him. The receptionist flipped through the records, oblivious to the tension crackling in the air. I'm sorry, sir, she said after a moment, but we can't release patient information unless you're listed as next of kin. The man barely reacted, but Helen didn't miss the way his jaw tensed. He wasn't surprised by the response. He had expected it. But he also wasn't leaving. And just like that, the past came crashing back, more alive than ever. "I understand," he said smoothly, slipping something across the counter, something small, but heavy looking. Helen didn't need to see it to know it was money. "But maybe you could check again." Helen's breath caught. This isn't just a concerned friend. This was something else. Something bigger. The receptionist hesitated, glancing around as if debating whether to accept the bribe. Helen took a step back, her pulse hammering. She had no idea who this man was, but one thing was clear: her patient wasn't just some nameless drifter who had collapsed in the street. Someone was looking for him. And they were willing to pay to find him. A sick feeling settled in Helen's stomach. If this man got to him first, she might never get the answers she needed. She turned back toward the bed, her decision made in an instant. The past she had tried to bury was clawing its way back to the surface, and she couldn't afford to ignore it anymore. She had to keep him alive. For now. Helen moved fast. She didn't have a plan, not really, but her instincts had kicked in, honed by years of working in the ER, making split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. Right now, she wasn't just a nurse. She was a woman with a past she couldn't ignore, standing at the crossroads of a decision that could change everything. She turned back to the bed, glancing at the monitors. The man's pulse was weak, his breathing shallow, but he was still alive. Barely. She couldn't let him slip away, not yet. Without giving herself time to second guess, she grabbed the floor stand and began adjusting the fluids. If she could stabilize him just enough to buy herself time, then maybe, just maybe, she could get the truth before it was too late. Behind her, the man in the dark coat was still at the front desk. Helen could hear his voice, low and controlled, but persistent. He wasn't leaving without answers. She had no idea who he was or why he was looking for her patient, but everything in her gut told her this wasn't just a simple reunion. This was something dangerous. She reached into her pocket and gripped the old wallet tighter, her fingers brushing over the worn edges. Her patient, the man she had tried so hard to forget, was more than just an old memory. He was a loose end in something much bigger. And now, so was she. The man in the coat turned suddenly, scanning the room. Helen ducked her head, pretending to focus on the patient's vitals. He was looking. Searching. For him. For her. Her mind raced. If she stayed here, it was only a matter of time before the man put the pieces together. She needed to move. Now. She didn't think, she just acted. With careful but quick hands, she unlocked the brakes on the gurney and, in one smooth motion, began wheeling the patient toward the hallway that led to the restricted area of the hospital. If she could get into a private room, somewhere away from prying eyes, she could figure out her next move. But she had barely made it 10 feet when a voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, nurse." Helen's grip on the gurney tightened, but she didn't stop. She kept walking, kept pushing forward. A second later, footsteps followed. Helen. Her breath caught. He knew her name. She turned slowly, keeping her expression neutral, though her pulse was hammering. The man stood just a few feet away, watching her with the kind of calm that sent alarms screaming through her brain. "I believe you have someone I'm looking for," he said, his gaze flickering to the unconscious man on the bed. Helen forced herself to hold his stare. "I'm sorry," she said evenly, "but patient information is confidential." The man smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. "That's the thing," he said, stepping closer. "He's not just a patient. And you know that, don't you?" Helen swallowed hard. He was too close now, his presence suffocating. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to get away from this man and whatever he was involved in. Then, before she could react, the man's hand slipped inside his coat. Not for a weapon, at least, not one she could see. Instead, he pulled out a folded piece of paper and held it out to her. Helen hesitated before taking it, her fingers shaking slightly as she unfolded it. The moment she saw what was inside, the air in her lungs vanished. It was a photograph. Old, faded, but unmistakable. A picture of her patient. From years ago. Standing beside a man she recognized instantly. Her father. Helen felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. Her vision tunneled, her heartbeat roaring in her ears. No. This wasn't possible. She looked back at the unconscious man, everything clicking into place at once. The past she had tried so hard to forget. The things she had buried, the truths she had refused to face. The man in the bed wasn't just some ghost from her past. He wasn't just someone she had known. He was the reason her father had disappeared. And now, after all these years, he had come back dying, helpless, dragging the past with him. Helen's hands clenched around the edges of the photograph. She had spent so many years wondering, searching for answers that never came. And now, here they were, right in front of her. But before she could say anything, before she could even begin to process what this meant, the man in the coat spoke again, his voice softer now. "He's not who you think he is." Helen's breath hitched. She looked at the man on the bed, then back at the stranger in front of her. For years, she had believed she was the victim of a story that had ended long ago. But she had been wrong. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning.